All right, so blood pressure. Huh. I got to say, when I first saw this as the topic for the deep dive, I was like, okay, seems kind of basic. But then I saw the stuff you sent over, and wow, there's way more to this than I thought.
Yeah, a lot of people think they understand blood pressure, but it's actually pretty fascinating how much there is to learn.
For sure. I mean, everyone knows the whole 120 over 80 thing. But one of the articles from the MT Spot mentioned that even what's considered normal has changed, right?
Oh, absolutely. The American College of Cardiology considers 130 over 80 to be stage 1 hypertension now. It definitely makes you stop and think.
Okay, so it's not just about a single number then? What else should we be thinking about?
Well, it's not just about the numbers themselves, but also about the context. For example, high blood pressure is often called the silent killer, but sometimes there are warning signs, and some of them are pretty surprising.
Okay, now I'm curious. What kind of surprising symptoms?
Well, we've got the usual suspects like headaches and dizziness. But did you know that frequent nosebleeds can also be a red flag? That was in that same article from the MT Spot. And it can even manifest as vision changes or tinnitus, that constant ringing in the ears.
See, nosebleeds. That's not what I would guessed. But like high blood pressure can really sneak up on you. But it's not just one thing, right? There are different types of high blood pressure.
You're exactly right. One of your sources described it as a family tree, which I thought was a great way to put it. There's systemic hypertension, which is the most common, but then you've got categories like local hypertension and different levels of severity.
Okay, so walk me through this family tree a bit. Give me the need-to-know branches, but definitely tell me about some of the more interesting ones too. You know, the kind of stuff that'll impress my doctor.
All right, so under systemic, you've got your essential hypertension, which is the most common. But then there's masked hypertension, which is fascinating because people with this type have normal blood pressure readings at the doctor's office, but their numbers spike in everyday life.
Wow, that's so sneaky. So they might not even realize there's a problem.
Exactly. That's why at-home monitoring can be so crucial for catching those fluctuations. And then, of course, there's white coat hypertension, which I'm sure a lot of us have experienced that nervousness-induced spike when you're at the doctor's office.
Oh, tell me about it. Just the sight of that blood pressure cuff makes my arm tense up. But those aren't the only types, right? What about local hypertension? What's that all about?
So local hypertension is when the pressure is high in specific areas of the body, and it can have some serious consequences. Take ocular hypertension, for instance. That's where the pressure is elevated inside the eye, and it's a major risk factor for glaucoma.
It's wild how something we think of as so simple, like just blood pressure,
Yeah.
can actually be so many different things. It's like they say, if you've met one person with hypertension, you've met one person with hypertension. But okay, let's talk about something that at least seems pretty simple on the surface, salt. One of the sources went surprisingly deep on this. I always thought it was just like too much salt, bad for blood pressure.
Right. You'd think it would be that straightforward. And it's generally true that reducing salt is good advice. But it turns out our bodies don't all react the same way to salt.
Really? So it's not as simple as salt is the enemy.
Not necessarily. The research on this is really interesting. Some people are what they call salt sensitive, meaning their blood pressure spikes even with just a little extra sodium. But for others, the connection isn't as strong.
So how do you know if you're salt sensitive? Should we all be carrying around those little salt packets just in case?
I wouldn't recommend that. But it does highlight how important it is to pay attention to your body's signals. It can be helpful to track your salt intake for a bit and see how your blood pressure responds. If you notice a correlation, then, to be more mindful.
Okay, so it's all about listening to your body and not just following these general rules.
Yeah.
I like that. Speaking of which, the source also mentioned a bunch of lifestyle changes for managing blood pressure. Is there anything that stands out to you as being particularly effective? I'll admit I'm already pretty good about eating my vegetables.
Well, you're ahead of the game then. But even if you're eating your vegetables, there are still some nuances to diet that can make a big difference.
Like what?
Well, take the DASH diet, for example. It's not just about eating a lot of vegetables, it's about eating specific ones like leafy greens. And it also limits saturated fats and cholesterol. But even beyond diet, one of the most overlooked factors is sleep.
Wait, sleep? Seriously. I mean, I know it's important for, well, everything, but how does sleep affect blood pressure?
It's all connected. When you don't get enough sleep, your body goes into this mild but chronic state of stress. And that means your body is releasing stress hormones like cortisol, even when you're not even thinking about being stressed.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do those stress hormones actually impact your blood pressure?
So cortisol can actually constrict your blood vessels, and that makes your heart work harder to pump blood through your body. Over time, this can lead to a sustained increase in blood pressure.
So basically, if I'm not sleeping enough, my body thinks it's in fight or flight mode even when there's nothing to fight.
Yeah,
And that's really bad for my blood pressure in the long run.
you bet.
Okay, I am definitely getting my 8 hours tonight.
Hmm.
But before we wrap up, there was one more connection in the research that really stood out to me. And it's a bit more serious, the link between hypertension and brain health. So what can you tell us about that?
This is really important. Uncontrolled hypertension doesn't just damage blood vessels in the heart, it can also damage those in the brain. And this can have a huge impact on your cognitive function. This includes things like your memory, your thinking skills, and it can even increase the risk of dementia later in life.
It's kind of scary when you think about it. Something like high blood pressure can actually affect our brains like that.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize that everything is connected.
It really does. When we talk about health, we're talking about the entire system, not just individual parts.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm feeling a lot more informed, but I also have to admit, I'm a little overwhelmed. There's so much to keep track of. What's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to pay attention to your own body and advocate for your own health. Don't ignore symptoms, even if they seem small or unconnected. And remember, what we know about blood pressure is always changing. What we know today is different from what we knew even a few years ago. So be curious, ask questions, and stay informed.
That's great advice. It's not just about managing a number. It's about understanding what that number means for our health, both now and in the future.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for walking us through all of this. I feel like I learned a year's worth of information in just a few minutes. And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and often surprising world of blood pressure. Until next time.